How's it going, everyone? Today we are going to be talking about the blood. And in previous lectures, I've already mentioned that the blood is going to carry many nutrients, gases like oxygen and CO2, waste products, hormones, ions, molecules, all sorts of things are going to travel throughout the blood. And today, we're going to talk a little bit about those different elements, but we're also going to introduce the different types of blood cells, including erythrocytes or red blood cells, leukocytes or white blood cells, and then platelets. We'll also be talking about certain responses and certain functions that the blood has, and then ultimately what goes into blood groups and blood types. Consider the blood this big pathway, this big waterway that transports gases, nutrients, wastes all throughout the body. But it also plays a big role in the balance of our fluid, our H2O, our pH, and our body temperature. And it's going to help transport cells that play a role in protecting us when we damage certain vessels throughout the body. That's going to happen through what's called platelets, which we'll discuss later. And it's also going to carry these immune cells throughout the body that are going to be responsible for helping to clean up damaged cells and proteins, and also fight off different microbes or bacteria or viruses that help or that enter the body. The blood is made up of mostly plasma, which is the fluid portion, so that's going to include water, some cells, some proteins, some cellular fragments in there. But when you actually look at blood, if you cut yourself, let's say, you're going to see this red liquid. But if you centrifuged it, which, you put in a little vial and put it on the centrifuge and it mixes up all the blood, when it settles, you could clearly see the separation of the different components. And in addition to the plasma and the cellular elements in there, we also have what's called red blood cells or erythrocytes. And so the hematocrit is going to be the percentage of red blood cells to the total blood. And so for males, that's roughly 47%. And for females, it's 42%. And the difference there comes from the hormone testosterone, which helps trigger EPO release and synthesis and release. And we'll talk a little bit more about EPO later. But again, when we just look at the blood as a whole on average, again, we're going to see this 45% roughly red blood cells, this little layer of, all the white blood cells and platelets, which are going to make up less than 1% of the components, and then the plasma. We could see that the blood makes up 8% of the body weight that we have. And again, 55% is plasma, which includes mostly water, some proteins, and some other solutes like electrolytes, nutrients, gases, etc. The other component of the blood is going to be, like we said, the cellular elements, and that's going to be platelets and leukocytes, the platelets and white blood cells. And then we'll talk about white blood cells and their distribution and the different types in a little bit. But then most of those cellular elements are those erythrocytes, those red blood cells that are going to be responsible for carrying oxygen and CO2 throughout the body. There are many different plasma proteins which are going to have their own specific functions, but all of these proteins are going to contribute to that filtration pressure that we talked about in the last lecture. So these proteins maintain what's called the plasma colloid osmotic pressure. So when we talked about filtration of materials from the bloodstream to the intracellular fluid, those proteins are playing a role in that. But as far as functions are concerned, the most abundant protein, albumin, is going to help transport steroids and fatty acids. The second most abundant protein, globulins, are going to be subcategorized into alpha and beta, which play a role in the transportation of iron, lipids, and vitamins. But we also have what's called gamma globulins. And one of the most important gamma globulins are immunoglobulins, which are antibodies. And so these are going to help in the process of fighting off different pathogens, different microbes, viruses, etc. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about leukocytes and white blood cells. But then we have even more proteins. Fibrinogen is one that is going to help in the formation of a blood clot. And that, again, we'll talk about when we talk about platelets. But the blood plasma, if you filtered it of all of these proteins, you'd be left with what's called serum. And that is just the plasma without the proteins again. So mostly water, electrolytes, ions, just all of that blood plasma without the proteins. There are three main types of blood cells. Erythrocytes, which are called red blood cells. They're going to help in the transportation of O2 and CO2. Leukocytes, which are white blood cells that play a role in the immune process and the cleanup within our bodies. And then platelets, which are going to release chemicals which lead to blood clotting and prevent the bleeding out of certain vessels that are damaged. The formation of all blood cells are going to start within the bone marrow, where pluripotent hematopoietic stem cells are going to be either converted to myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. And at these two levels, they do not yet have a designated pathway to ultimately what's going to be our final blood cell. But then these two types of stem cells get committed to their pathway, so there's a direct lineage to the cell they're going to wind up being. And these cells are influenced by things like cytokines and colony stimulating factors and interleukins. And what those signaling molecules are going to do is then basically aid the pathway in the formation of these blood cells, whether it be erythrocytes, platelets, or leukocytes. Erythrocytes are, again, commonly known as red blood cells, and they're going to be critical in the transportation of oxygen from the lungs to the cells of the body, so cells can carry out aerobic respiration. But in addition to that, all the CO2 that gets dumped off from the cells of the body, well, some of that will travel on erythrocytes to be transported back to the lungs, and then we'll exhale out that CO2. Here we could take a look at the different types of blood cells. Notice that the erythrocytes is this concave shaped disc, and these red blood cells are going to squeeze through the capillaries of our bloodstream and our circulation and dump off the O2, pick up CO2, and just make its way out through the bloodstream, and playing a role in transporting these blood gases. What oxygen actually binds to in the red blood cell, in the erythrocyte, is called hemoglobin. And notice the prefix. This means that this protein is going to contain an iron that is in the center, which is going to allow oxygen to bind to this red blood cell, to this protein, in order for it to be transported throughout the bloodstream. And so an erythrocyte can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules, but it's going to be where we carry 99% of the oxygen in our bloodstream. Again, the shape is biconcave. The red blood cells do not have a nucleus. It falls out once it is converted, and this is going to make extra room for that hemoglobin, so we're able to carry as much oxygen as possible. And you're going to see that red blood cells, they have a very short lifespan, just a few months, and then we're constantly producing more red blood cells in order to keep up with that blood gas transportation throughout the body. They are a simple structure, but strong and flexible, which is what you need. So they're able to, again, go through these blood vessels and these small pathways and not become damaged. And so, these strong cells are going to be able to transport oxygen and play a vital role in our survival. So red blood cells have this very specific function, and in order to maximize that function, the sort of design of that cell is, very advantageous. That biconcave nature allows it to have a great surface area, and when you talk about diffusion of gases, through a wall, you're going to want the most surface area as possible, right? So if I was trying to get something from one side of the wall to another side of a wall, then I would want as many people as possible lined up across the wall, more surface area making contact, so then we could get something from one side to the next. And a good thing about red blood cells is that they use anaerobic metabolism, glucose metabolism, carbohydrate metabolism for their energy production, meaning that all the oxygen that they're carrying, they're not going to be greedy and use all of it. And that means more oxygen for the rest of the cells and the organs in the body. Here we could see the molecular structure of that protein hemoglobin, which is responsible for carrying the oxygen. We could see that the hemoglobin is divided into 4 subunits, each which contain an iron in the center. There are 2 beta subunits and 2 alpha subunits, each which could carry up to 1 molecule of oxygen per iron. So we could see that in the center here is that iron molecule surrounded by, and this is probably a little bit, advanced and for upper level courses, surrounded by these amino acids called histidines. And what's going to happen is when oxygen comes along, oxygen is going to bind to the center here, and these amino acids are basically going to lock it into place. And since this protein is a long strain of amino acids, once one oxygen molecule binds to one of these subunits, then it's going to have a specific property for this protein called cooperativity, because that shifting of one amino acid is going to lead to the whole amino acid chain being altered. And then what that's going to do, that small change, is going to increase the affinity for hemoglobin to bind to more oxygen. So once one oxygen molecule binds to one of the subunits, then it's more likely that the other subunits are also going to be filled with oxygen. And what's going to happen is that red blood cell is going to pick up those oxygen molecules. The blood as a whole goes from the heart, the left ventricle, out to the rest of the body. And then oxygen is going to stay attached until it gets to a place with low concentrations and low partial pressures of oxygen. Remember, I've said in the past that gases and liquids, they move from areas of high concentration and pressure to low concentrations and pressure. And so this red blood cells, now with oxygen, that blood is highly oxygenated, is going to come across some cells with low oxygen, right? Because they're metabolizing it and using it. And that oxygen, those differences in pressure, is going to force that oxygen to be unbound to the hemoglobin and then be transported or dumped off to the cells we are transporting it to. Most of the carbon dioxide that is transported throughout the body is transported as what's called bicarbonate. Actually, it's only a small percentage of the carbon dioxide actually binds to the red blood cells itself. But the red blood cells are responsible for converting this carbon dioxide to bicarbonate and then transporting that throughout the bloodstream back to our lungs to be exhaled out. And so, speaking of exhaling, what comes out when you exhale is CO2 and water vapor. And so that is how we are able to transport it throughout the bloodstream, by making a reaction that combines these two things. And that's how we're going to get bicarbonate. And so this is all done through an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. And the reaction is going to be that these two molecules are going to come together to form carbonic acid. And then the hydrogen, one of these hydrogens out of the two, are going to break off. That hydrogen attaches itself to the red blood cell. And this molecule here, bicarbonate, that's what's going to travel throughout the bloodstream. And so once the blood, that venous blood, makes its way back up to the lungs, what's going to happen is that same enzyme is actually going to convert the bicarbonate and the hydrogen back the other way. So hydrogen gets added back to bicarbonate, we get carbonic acid, and then carbonic acid is converted to CO2 and H2O, which is how we breathe it out. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we discuss the pulmonary system, but this is how it's transported, how CO2 is transported throughout the bloodstream. When oxygen levels get low within the blood, the kidneys are going to pick up on this and release a hormone called erythropoietin. And this hormone is going to start and signal the production of red blood cells, otherwise known as erythropoiesis. And so these red blood cells don't have a long lifespan, just about 120 days, because again, these cells don't have a nucleus, so they can't make proteins and replace damaged proteins. So it's a pretty short amount of time before they're just recycled and their cellular components reused. And so the signaling response for erythrocyte production has been used by many coaches and trainers of aerobic and endurance athletes in order to improve their performance. And so one example of this is altitude. And so in altitude compared to sea level, there are lower pressures of oxygen. And so when you go up to a place of high elevation like Denver, like Mexico City, one of these adaptations that's going to happen in the body is that in order to keep up with oxygen demand, this erythropoietin is going to be released. And, at altitude, you are going to have more red blood cells that are produced. And this increases the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood. And if you're an athlete, that's an endurance athlete or an aerobic athlete, you are going to want that. That's going to help benefit your performance. And so many coaches have a strategy of either training or residing athletes within these higher altitude in order to improve their aerobic performance. The triggering of this response again starts with low levels of oxygen that is picked up by the kidneys, and then erythropoietin is going to signal the pro-erythroblasts to be converted into reticulocytes, which ultimately leads to larger numbers of red blood cells. And then once we have more red blood cells, we can increase the amount of oxygen carried by the blood, and therefore the oxygen dumped off to the cells that are using it. So the red blood cell is going to be produced by stem cells of the red bone marrow, and then once that red blood cell spends its 120 days picking up oxygen, picking up CO2. Eventually, it's going to be recycled for its parts. And so the red blood cell will be picked up by macrophages in the spleen and the liver or the red bone marrow. And then its parts are basically recycled. So we got globulins, which are proteins. And so those amino acids can be used for protein synthesis. The heme is going to be divided into iron, which then can be reused in order to make more red blood cells. And then the biliverdin is converted to bilirubin, and then we're just going to dispose of that bilirubin through the liver, the small intestine, the large intestine, and then eventually we'll just get rid of it and excrete it out of our bodies. White blood cells have a different function. They're not responsible for carrying oxygen and CO2, so there's no hemoglobin, but they will protect the body from invading pathogens. These white blood cells actually do contain a nucleus and the different organelles that most normal cells have, and they are going to be responsible for carrying out certain immune functions and getting rid of different materials within the body that we don't need. Leukocytes can either be divided into granulocytes or agranulocytes, and so these different granulocytes are going to contain different granules that will break apart the things that they ingest. So eosinophils are going to contain acidic granules, basophils contain alkaline granules, and then neutrophils, granules that are neither acidic nor basic. The agranulocytes, again, do not contain these materials that break down the certain pathogens or whatever these leukocytes here are going to pick up, but they will be also responsible for protecting the body in the immune response. Lymphocytes, one of the 5 types of leukocytes, are going to be divided into their own subcategories, which are B lymphocytes, T lymphocytes, and then natural killer cells. And B lymphocytes we're going to see when we discuss these cells more in the immune chapter. These are going to be the ones responsible coming up with these antibodies that are going to help fight off certain pathogens and certain microbes that enter our bodies. Again, the main function of leukocytes are to defend against invading pathogens and abnormal cells. Really, when we get to the immune chapters where we're going to discuss their specific functions, but they are an important part of this immune system and each have their own roles. And so they each have also their own sort of strategies and tools to fight off against specific pathogens. And so basophils, for example, release histamine, which causes inflammation, and signals for other cells called phagocytes to the region of damaged tissue. Just like red blood cells, leukocytes are synthesized in the bone marrow, and the process is called leukopoiesis. And these leukocytes have a longer lifespan than red blood cells and can live for several months or even years. Platelets are cellular fragments within the bloodstream that are going to help promote what is called blood clotting, which occurs when we have damage to vessels inside of the body. And in order to prevent bleeding out of our circulatory system, what's going to happen are that these platelets release chemicals, and that's going to lead eventually to the repair of these damaged vessels. Platelets are derived from megakaryoplasts that mature into megakaryocytes. These megakaryocyte cells are then fragmented. So for one megakaryocyte, you get around 2,000 to 3,000 plasma membrane-bound pieces that come off. And this process is known as thrombopoiesis. And again, the main function of these platelets to stop blood loss in damaged vessels. So how does this hemostasis, as it's called, occur? Well, there's 3 different mechanisms that must happen. 1 is called the vascular spasm. 2 is called the formation of the platelet plug. And 3 is the blood clotting. Once the vessel is damaged, the vascular spasm will occur, and what happens here is that there will be a constriction of the blood vessel. And what this does, again, from the previous chapter, is it prevents more blood from going into this vessel and then ultimately being lost because this vessel is damaged. And so we just cut off as much blood flow as we can to that vessel. It can last several minutes to several hours, and it just allows the whole process of repair to begin within this damaged vessel. We're going to see that platelets that are traveling along through the bloodstream are going to be attracted to sites of damaged vessels due to von Willebrand factors. And so platelets will start to adhere to the site of this damage. And then what's going to happen is that these platelets, although they are really small, they contain a lot of chemicals. And they're going to release these chemicals into the bloodstream. And what that's going to do is activate other platelets that are coming along and lead to a shape change. And eventually, things like thromboxane A2 are going to promote the adhesion of more platelets to the site of the damage. And eventually what's going to happen is that those platelets will aggregate and form this platelet plug, which helps stop the bleeding from this damaged vessel. The last thing that needs to occur at the site of a damaged vessel is the blood coagulation, or the formation of a blood clot. And there's both an extrinsic and an intrinsic pathway which can lead to the formation of this blood clot. But thrombin is going to play a role, and by strengthening the fibrin threads, we're actually changing the structure of the blood. And it's going to turn from more into this liquid state where it normally is in to more of a gel type state in this blood clot. And what that prevents, it prevents any bleeding, any further bleeding out. And so then the vessel that is damaged can be repaired, and then we return back to normal function. So this whole process of hemostasis, the vascular spasm helps reduce blood flow, the platelet adhesion and the formation of the platelet plug helps to prevent further bleeding, so does blood coagulation, and eventually this vessel can be repaired and function can return to normal. You may have heard of blood type before, and it'd be very important to know what type of blood that you have. But where do these blood types come from? A, B, O? Well, it all has to do with the proteins and antigens that are found on red blood cell. And so antigens are just recognizable proteins that our cells of the body pick up on. And so And if you have type A blood, your erythrocytes, your red blood cells, are going to have A antigens. Type B blood, B antigens. If you have AB blood, both antigens. If you have type O blood, neither antigen. And what happens is that in addition to the antigens on our red blood cells, our plasma carries antibodies. And so what you're going to find is that if you have type A blood, you're going to have anti-B antibodies. And if you have type B blood, well, then you're going to have anti-A antibodies. And so we could see here a diagram that sort of better depicts this. Type A blood will have those A antigens and anti-B antibodies. Type B, the opposite, B antigens and anti-A antibodies. Type AB blood, both antigens, but neither antibody. And type O blood, neither antigen, but both antibodies. And these characteristics allow for, certain qualities when we are talking about what type of blood can be transfused from person to person. And so type O blood is going to be the universal donor. And why that is because if a type A person or type B or type AB person receives O blood, well, no matter what type of antibody they have, or if they don't even have antibodies, it doesn't matter, because the red blood cells that they're receiving don't have antigens. So type O, universal donor, and type AB blood, universal acceptor, because no matter what blood type it gets, it doesn't have the antibodies that are going to lead to agglutination. And what that is when you get a clumping of cells in our bloodstream, and that is going to lead to the rupture of these red blood cells, which can cause damage to the kidneys and ultimately be fatal. And so that's why it's very important when it comes to blood transfusion, and things like kidney replacements, you have to match blood types between people in order to prevent this. So where does the positive and negative come from when it comes to blood types? It all comes from what's called the rhesus antigen, which was first discovered in rhesus monkeys. And so if you have that rhesus antigen on your erythrocytes, you are going to be considered positive, while the absence of that rhesus antigen, you'd be considered negative. So when you talk about A+, you have both A antigens and the rhesus antigen. So when does this become important? Well, one, for blood transfusion, again, because, if you have that antibody present and then you receive this blood with rhesus antigen in it, that could cause potential problems. But then another devastating issue is when it comes to pregnancy. And this is what's called hemolytic disease of the newborn. What happens in this disease is that a rhesus negative mother is going to have a fetus with those rhesus antigens. And what's going to happen is that the mother is then going to produce these anti-rhesus antibodies by her immune cells. And then what can happen is that during a second pregnancy, if the fetus is positive for these rhesus antigens, those antibodies can go across the placenta and cause damage to those erythrocytes. And this can lead to some complications when the newborn comes into the world. And so, this is unfortunate, but, just sort of the physiological processes that can occur due to blood typing. That's a really depressing way to end the lecture, but that will be it as far as blood is concerned. So we talked all about the different components of the blood, the different cells of the blood, their functions, the blood clotting and what that does as far as damaged vessels are concerned, and different blood types. The next lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about temperature regulation. It should be a short video. We're just going to describe what happens when the temperature of our bodies is increased or decreased, and what physiological events occur, how that involves the blood, in order to then either raise temperature of our bodies or lower temperature in our bodies. Thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next video.